sore throat, can't do it.
Well, we still got 3 minutes. Stupid me. Just break it in. Thank you. Wouldn't you know it? I dropped that. Broke the cars.
Joe Campbell.
These don't come out till when we do the 60s.
Is that when you're doing it? Yeah. I hope we can speed it up without talking too fast.
Two-minute warning.
Just wait a minute. We have to sit down.
Got a wardrobe malfunction.
Pardon? Okay. You started with your introduction. You got to stay.
No, Pat does that.
We're going to have to borrow a mic for just a few minutes. We're going to have to borrow a mic for just a few minutes right before you start.
They belong to the church. They don't belong to us.
Well,
for your part, you mean?
We have to what?
We need to use the mic. Kent Harkey needs to say something, and then I'm going to say something before y'all start.
Are they detachable?
No, we're just going to stand here.
That's fine.
Okay.
Sure.
Wait, but Kent's going to be first.
6:59.
I know. That's why we're ready. He's coming.
It's touchy. I think it doesn't want to work. Is that you? What? It'll survive.
He doesn't know I'm taking his spot. Good evening. I'm Kent Harkey. Welcome to the Health Heroes Part 2. We're glad to be back together. I would like to just share a few comments with you before we get started. We would like to recognize a member of the Historical Society who has contributed so much to the society, to our community, upon his retirement. So let me just share these words. Dear Gene, congratulations on the incredible gift and legacy of 124 years of continuous service of business in service to this wide community. The wealth of extraordinary memories, family lore, and knowledge of momentous events must be absolutely staggering and breathtaking. Long observing your own unselfish generosity to what is good, noble, and worthwhile speaks volumes about the history, influence, and impact of Starnes Jewelers and the quiet and effective leadership of each of its previous owners. Your many expressions of support and involvement in your hometown are exceptional. This energy, enthusiasm, and commitment challenge each of us to want to highlight and preserve the rich and unique history of this wonderful place we call home. Members of the Stanley County Historical Society are privileged to call you our long respected and dear friend. We commend you for your integrity and character in maintaining the highest ethical standards in the conduct of your profession. We salute you for your exceptional training, experience, and background serving thousands of customers who trust you and your opinions completely. And we express our gratitude to you for the kindness interest in, and welcoming spirit you have always shown to those who cross your daily path. We look forward to traveling the road ahead with you in this a new and exciting chapter. Congratulations on your well-deserved retirement.
Very quickly, I want to thank a few people who have helped us prepare for this event. Roger Udy, of course, was taking our pictures tonight. Mark Sample and Brian Jones are our tech guys at the back who will keep everything going for us. Joan Udy, Ruth Cotton, and Chris Bramlett helped check the attendance as you were coming in, which is important for us. And Joyce Lambert and Kent Harkey were busy selling tickets for our spring courtyard and garden event. So I hope that if you didn't get a ticket, or, well, I guess it's not really a ticket, but an armband or a brochure about it, they have a table here, and I believe there was a table at the back with Kent. So check on that before you leave. 2 or 3 housekeeping things. If you need a restroom during the evening, go out the door over here to my left, go all the way down the hall to the office area, and you will see a sign to your left that will take you just right down a shorter hallway, but you'll see the restrooms on either side of the water fountain.
You have to have a doctor's note to be excused, don't you? Okay.
And if we should have to exit the building, the doors that you came in on this side and the one at the back, both that go out toward the City Hall, will be open. So if for any reason we do need to exit the building, those are available. And also I wanted to, at the end of the program, we will be passing out some information about upcoming programs and special events. The next special event coming up will be April the 9th, which will be an airing of the quilts at the Snuggs or Mark's house? Snuggs' house? Yeah. Okay, at the Snuggs' house. That's April the 9th, and that's a free event. So be sure and come to the Snuggs house. You'll probably be getting some emails or other information about that. And tonight, the Historical Society is pleased to have Dr. Eric Johnson and Dr. Stephen Seltzer. They are finally going to get to do part 2. Back in August of 2019, they shared part 1 of Health Heroes of Past Decades. They came up to about the 1950s. Tonight, in part 2, they're going to start in the 1950s and come forward until about 1985. So you have a lot to look forward to. They're eager to get started, so I'm going to get out of their way and let them take over. The mics are yours, guys.
Sure. Yeah, we decided instead of wearing a tie, we were going to wear our support the Ukrainians tonight.
The following program has been neither produced nor directed. I'm calling for Mike Liddell, president of My Pillow. You know, the banks, the companies, and our competitors are, people, ladies and gentlemen, it's not too late to sign up to get your extended car warranty in for it. All right, calm down. How many surgeons does it take to change a light bulb? 1, but it'll be delayed because the surgeon has to find a suitable tungsten donor to perform a filament transplant. Welcome to Health Heroes of Prior Decades, Stanley County Physicians Part 2, brought to you by the Stanley County Historical Society and the Stanley County History Center. This is Dr. Eric Johnson, S-E-N, and I'm Dr. Steve Seltzer. Collectively, we logged 82 years in studying, training, and practicing medicine, the last 72 of which we spent in private family practice in Stanley County. We're retired from active practice, and thus we are permitted to have memory lapses and wandering soliloquies, so we ask for your patience and tolerance during this evening. We have no financial affiliation with Stanley County Historical Society, the Stanley History Center, nor Central United Methodist Church. We have received no monetary compensation or items of any value in return for our preparation and delivery of this program. Some general housekeeping rules, amending or adding to what Pat has just said. We have no restrictions against photography nor audio or video recording during the presentation. We do request the audience please save questions and comments until after the conclusion of our talk. We are elderly and we become distracted easily. We do not want our already age-impaired trains of thought to become derailed and result in degeneration to a monologue of how to palm an ace and win at blackjack. Both Dr. Johnson and I will be available here at the podium after the program. We will gladly entertain questions and discussion from those in attendance. We will be more than happy to sign memorabilia and or have our pictures taken with you and your family members for a fee. Please keep your wallets and checkbooks handy. We do take Visa, MasterCard, Discovery, American Express, Apple Pay, Google Pay, and PayPal, but we do not deal with cryptocurrency or Bitcoins. Next up is the very important list of acknowledgments modeled after the annual Academy Award ceremony in Hollywood. Please nobody slap us or hurl obscenities at us if we insult you or your family members. Both Dr. Johnson and I are very humbled and indebted to the number of people who volunteered their assistance in order that we could babble in front of this audience. We express our thanks to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for the blessing of being able to assemble with friends in a free country. In no set order, we appreciate and recognize Central United Methodist Church and Pastor Jill Reinhardt for the use of this building. In addition, Curator Megan Sullivan and historian Paul Morrison of the Stanley County History Center deserve our thanks for their invaluable aid in retrieving archived information. Pat Bramlett of the Historical Society did tireless work in preparing for this encore presentation after the initial program. Kent Harkey, Historical Society President and tireless advocate of our credo, preserving our heritage. Also, we're indebted to the History Center volunteers as well as volunteers at local museum facilities in Baden, New London, Norwood, Locust, and Oakboro for their assistance, plus multiple community residents and former co-workers and physicians who provided much useful information and many legendary stories about the doctors you'll hear about shortly. Lastly, we are indebted to 5 men who provided a great deal of information about many of the notables of this era. Specifically, we tip our caps to Ben Jolly and Doctors Bob Gaither, Bill Jolly, Rufus Leffler, and Whitman Smith, and to our videographers as well. And extra special thanks go to our wives, Judy Johnson and Marlene Seltzer, who offered unflagging support for this task, which was spawned over 3 years ago. This has required far more effort than we ever envisioned at its outset, but it has been truly fascinating and educational. If we have overlooked recognizing anybody else, please forgive us, we're ancient and forgetful. Now for the nitty-gritty. It has been 945 days since we last stood on this site and presented part 1 of the history of Stanley County physicians. A tiny virus very few of us have ever heard of detailed our plans to proceed with tonight's presentation on 5 separate occasions. I think they've run out of letters in the Greek alphabet, so I hope we're clear. Before we go any further, I want to clarify that in our prior program, we stated that Health Heroes Part 2 would be from 1950 to 2020 and would follow after Part 1. After surveying the scope of covering 70 years in the world and medical care in Stanley County that had changed extensively, we felt that we simply had to divide that 70-year time span after 1950 into 2 parts and present the first of these halves, now referred to as Part 2, whereby you will hear about physicians tonight from 1950 through 1985. Coming up, hopefully in 2023, provided there is no pandemic or other major glitch, is the final installment of this series. And to review where we've been and where we're going, here's a summary of the first episode of Health Heroes. We chose not to discuss Dr. Francis Crone, who is credited with being the first physician in Stanley County. There are extensive writings about Dr. Crone's life and accomplishments, and the museum at Morrill Mountain, as well as the History Center, have additional material about him. Instead, we began the previous program at 1850 and tried to mention and give a brief biography of every physician who practiced in Stanley County up to 1950. We were handicapped by lack of information in many cases, which is understandable in the pre-electric times of that period, and we were nearly overwhelmed by the limited time available to give a number of local doctors appropriate recognition, and these time constraints limited the volume of what we could say. There are a number of physicians in Stanley County whose careers crossed over our arbitrary milepost of 1950, and we elected to defer mention of most of them until tonight. However, we did decide to include the following health heroes in the initial talk, as we felt their service to Stanley County before, during, and after 1950 merited recognition in Part 1. To refresh your memories, these 5 doctors were Dr. Robert Fox, a health department physician, Dr. Fraser Lapsley from Baden, Dr. Nash McKenzie from Albemarle, Dr. Walter McClendon from Oakboro, and Dr. Essex Knoll from Kingville, South Albemarle. In the 2019 program, Dr. Johnson presented a very informative timeline about the history of medicine and significant milestones pertinent to medical care in Stanley County from 1850 to 1950. We are fortunate that he will again take us along the path of medical history and developments from 1950 until 1985. Additionally, we have expanded the format of this program to include significant events in Stanley County during this 35-year time span. We think you will enjoy linking memories of these newsworthy tidbits with the lives of the doctors we are discussing and your own lives. Lastly, we have included some intriguing sidebars. In our research, we uncovered several small world-type incidents that feature connections with people with the common denominator being Stanley County. In addition, there are a number of milestones in medical care that we'll want to spend some extra time discussing. We are still hampered by lack of information on a number of the physicians we will mention, and if you are disappointed that we did not give a particular doctor enough time, nor list his or her achievements in detail, please remember that we are under contract with the Entertainers Union not to overstep our time allotment, and I hope that we can move along in a timely fashion. We do have a lot of material to cover, though, and we want to give every person his or her due. We hope that we do not completely overlook any physician who practiced in Stanley County in this 35-year time frame, but if we did, please forgive us. As in Part 1, we are discussing only physicians, which would include MDs and DOs, dentists, chiropractors, optometrists, podiatrists, midwives, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and other healers are beyond the scope of this session. We don't move as swiftly as we formerly did. We beg you not to hurl objects at us if we do not perform up to your expectations. Okay, and we do not want to turn this into a filibuster, but if it runs over, there is a Lenten service at 12 noon tomorrow in this church, and they're going to serve lunch afterwards. Just as we did in August 2019, Dr. Johnson and I emphasized that we are paying homage to those hardworking health heroes of Stanley County who preceded us by not using electronic devices in any form for our presentation. We're speaking to you in the audience, person to person, without computers or PowerPoint presentations, just as the physicians in the 1950 to 1985 era did in their conversations, examinations, before the business world seized control of healthcare in America. The doctors in this time span in Stanley County were physicians, and their patients were human beings, and the doctors were not providers. With this prologue, then, I am turning the mic over to Dr. Johnson.
I have my own mic, thank you. Okay, 1950. President in 1950 was Harry S. Truman. The governor of North Carolina was W. Carr Scott, and the mayor of Albemarle was W. H. Morrow. Gasoline was 30 cents a gallon, and gas wars, 19 cents. Bread was $12 a loaf, and you go down to Confederate Motors and get a brand new Chevy Bel Air with white sidewall tires for $1,390. The federal minimum wage was 75 cents. And now return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. In 1950, we're getting right to mortality first. What were the leading causes of death in 1950? Number one was heart disease, which the number of people who died from heart disease about equaled all the others combined here. All forms of cancer, whether it be colon, prostate, breast, lung, or whatever. Then strokes, number three. Accidents, both motor vehicle accidents and all other accidents, or number four. Number five at that time was early problems with early infancies, prematurity. They had no respirators. Kids who developed respiratory distress syndrome, there was nothing they could do. If kid had heart defects or any congenital anomalies, they couldn't fix them back then. That was number five. Number six, influenza and pneumonia, which in 1900 was the number one killer, was now, thanks to antibiotics, was number six. Tuberculosis, which had been the number two killer in 1900, was now number seven. And hardening of the arteries was number eight, and then hardening of the arteries was number eight, and hardening of the, what does that mean?
It means you're fired.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Dementia was number 8. Number 9 was renal disease, kidney disease. There was no dialysis back in 1950, and diabetes of all types was the 10th leading cause of death. Now, these are some medical breakthroughs that came through in the 1950s. I'm cheating because I'm going to go to 1946 because the first cancer chemotherapy was finally available in 1946. The first heart defibrillators, which were stationary. You couldn't move them on a crash cart to the patient. The patient had to be by the machine when he arrested. Made it kind of difficult. 1949. The first mechanical assist for anesthesia was 1949. Before, the anesthesiologist had to bag the patient throughout the procedure. And this is very important because in 1950, one of the biggest medical breakthroughs, the first radio pagers became available, and the first page ever was to a doctor on a golf course. 1953, the heart-lung machine was developed. 1954, the first organ transplants were done to identical twins kidney transplants. It wasn't until 1954 that Watson and Crick proved that DNA held the genetic code. In 1955, incredible breakthrough, the Salk polio vaccine came out. In 56, the measured dose inhaler, the little spray for asthma, came out in 56. 57, the first EEG, the first the electronic brain scans were done. The first cardiac pacemaker, 1958. And how about this wonder drug? I think the McNeils carried it. It's called Tylenol. Came out in 1959. And during the 50s, with the advent of streptomycin, TB sanatoriums went out of business because they could now treat TB patients. They didn't have to isolate them. Insulin at that time was obtained in the slaughterhouse. They killed pigs and they killed cattle and they took the pancreas and they took the insulin out of there. That's where you got your insulin if you need it. And IVs were made up in the hospital. They didn't come up with bags full of them. Now, locally, on July 7th, 1950, the closing of 3 hospitals. The Yadkin General Hospital, which is now the Taylor House, the Stanley General Hospital, which was torn down, and that's where the courthouse is, and the hospital at Baden is now the conference center out there. And we had the opening of Stanley County Hospital. There was an act passed by Congress called the Hill Burton Act. It was a 50-50 deal that the government would match whatever the community could raise, and they would put that together and build a hospital, and that's where we got Stanley County Hospital. And there's a lot of very sacrificial giving by people who worked in the cotton mills then just to build that hospital. It was wonderful. But one of the conditions of the Hill Burton Act was that care was have to be given regardless of race, religion, creed, or ability to pay. Dr. Seltzer, do you know, I just read this curiosity. Did you know that there are no canaries on the Canary Islands?
No, I didn't
And
know
did
that.
you know that in the Virgin Islands, there are also no canaries? Okay. Medical care in Stanley County Hospital in its new hospital opened had 19 general practitioners and 3 general surgeons. The general practitioners made rounds at the hospital and did admissions and discharges, and again, they worked in their office and saw patients there. Industrial accidents at that time were taken to doctors' offices. They worked Saturdays. God, I'm glad we weren't back then. They did house calls, delivered babies. Dr. McKenzie told me that his last home delivery was 1954, and he was so grateful not to go to homes and deliver babies. And the incidence of cerebral palsy decreased when babies were born in hospitals. This is the golden age of general surgery. They did everything. They cut your chest, they'd cut your belly. I'm not going to point there, but they did some GYN procedures. They did vascular, working on arteries and veins. People had blood clots on the brain. They'd put a little hole up there and evacuate. They did bunches. They ripped out a lot of tonsils and adenoids back then. They're the ones who did C-sections in the hospital. They pinned broken hips back then. They did about everything. When Stanley County Hospital opened in 1950, there was no radiologist, no pathologist, there was no anesthesiologist, but there were what are called nurse anesthetists, which did a good job. There was no intensive care unit back there. There were no emergency room medications. There were no MDs, excuse me, no emergency room MDs. There were no ventilators, defibrillators. CPR was unknown. There were no nursing homes. There was a coroner's circumstances going back to Old England. There were not medically trained medical examiners at that time. And this, a real breakthrough, Pampers came out not until 1961. By the way, I'm going to remind you again that plagiarism is when you steal from one source and research is when you steal from multiple sources. I'm going to list, since we have one of the McNeil brothers here, I was going to tell you the pharmacies very quickly in 1950. See if you remember these. Morrell's, Purcell's, Phillips, Pike's out in Locust, Norwood Drug, which was in Norwood, Albemarle Drug Company, and Baden Drug Company. That's today's trivia question. Where was the Baden Drug Company located? Everybody. Very good. We got a good group here. Oakboro had the Barger Drug Company. There was a drug center in Albemarle, K&L Drug Store. I don't know if they made coffee also, but that was in Albemarle, and Lofton Drug Stores. And we didn't have a drug problem back then for those drug stores. Okay, I think, Dr. Seltzer, I probably, before my voice wears out, I'm going to let you talk now.
Okay, patient comes into the doctor's office and tells the doctor, I think I'm a goat. And the doctor says, well, how long have you felt that way? And he says, ever since I was a kid. We're going to do a little background on, continue the background before we get into the meat and potatoes of the doctors. Let's talk about the population. In 1950, the U.S. population was approximately 151 million. North Carolina had a little over 4 million residents. Stanley County, 37,081. In 1950, Charlotte had 133,000 residents, Raleigh 65,000, Concord 16,700. In Stanley County in 1950, Albemarle 11,298, Norwood 1,735, Locust 266, Oakboro 631. Stanfield was not incorporated then, and we don't know what their population was. Keep those figures in mind. We'll get back to them later. I want to talk about a little timeline on things in Stanley County so you can relate to this. He mentioned the opening of the new hospital, the closing of the old hospitals in July. In July 1950, the Wisconsin YMCA was dedicated. And in August of 1950, the Little Road Schoolhouse opened in Albemarle. In 52, in May, the cabins at Morrill Mountain opened. And in July of 1952, the Stanley County Ministerial Association lodged a protest against movie theaters in Stanley County showing motion pictures on Sundays. That protest didn't go very far. In 1953, the Carolina Solite plant near Aquadale belched out its first batch of black molten solite. In December of 1953, the former Yadkin Hospital, which was purchased and transformed into the Baptist Home for the Aging, now known as the Taylor House on Palmer Street, admitted the first patient. In 1954, in August, a white-fringed beetle infestation was reported around New London and just south of Albemarle. Everybody thought they came over from England in '63. In December 1954, Kettner's Supermarket, based in Salisbury, opened on North First Street in Albemarle, becoming the largest grocery store in Stanley County. Okay, that's where we were back then, and we're going to start with the doctors. And we've got some pretty prominent names. The first doctor I want to talk about is Dr. Thomas Kelly. Dr. Kelly was born in 1917 in Concord, Massachusetts, and attended public schools in
Concord, Massachusetts.
Concord, up there, you're right. And that's right. I stand corrected. And attended public schools in Waltham, Massachusetts. He earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and then in 1938, and then began to pursue a PhD in entomology, which I think studies insects, and parasitology, which studies parasites, at the University of California at Berkeley. That was before they had demonstrations and such. He did not complete that there. Rather, he had decided to go to medical school at Duke University, where he received his MD degree in 1946. After starting in 1942, he was a member of Alpha Omega Alpha, the Medical Honor Society, and graduated number uno in his class. World War II had just ended, but he entered the military service and served his internship at Balboa Hospital in Ancon Canal Zone, Panama, which was still a United States territory, and he stayed in there for 3 years and got to study lots of bugs and strange creatures there. In 1949, after his discharge from the Army, he began family practice in Albemarle, where his wife, the former Annie Ruth Smith, was from. His office was on West North Street in the block where Honeycutt Shoe Store was, and he stayed in that office and doing everything, to begin with house calls, home deliveries, emergency room work, rounds in the hospital, long hours in the office, and this continued until 1967 when he and 3 other physicians formed Albemarle Family Medical Center. Dr. Kelly was a good community volunteer. He had numerous accolades and achievements from medical organizations. In his spare time, what little he had, he was a volunteer physician for the Philmont Boy Scout Ranch in New Mexico. He's also a member of the Lions Club, Friends of the Pfeiffer College Library, and he volunteered to help seniors fill out their income tax forms at the senior center. And I think that was a lot less complicated than it is now, but he's to be lauded for that.
We're seniors now.
We are? All right, well, I pay an accountant to do my taxes. That's probably a mistake. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he was an ardent supporter of Duke University basketball and was an Iron Duke. He and Mrs. Kelly were ardent members of the Our Lady of Annunciation Catholic Church for their entire adult life. Dr. Kelly and his wife had 5 daughters and 1 son. And Dr. Kelly, after his retirement from practice in 1989, continued to serve as the medical director at the Lutheran Nursing Home and as the coordinator of the Records Review Committee at Stanley Manor for a number of years thereafter. Dr. Kelly passed on in 2005 at Carolinas Medical Center in Charlotte. It goes without saying that he was one of the true icons of medical care in this community. And I will say something, that Dr. Kelly was known for his use of vitamins. And a lot of patients came in the office who received IV vitamin C, which was called Sevalin, and they felt better, whether they had ingrown toenail or dandruff. That seemed to help them. He also prescribed a lot of oral vitamins and was often criticized for that, but his results for helping people were just as good as anybody else's, maybe better, because he did talk to his patients with that pronounced New England accent. Next up, George Edgar, quote, Buck, unquote, Edens Jr., another legendary Stanley County physician. Dr. Edens was born in Elmhurst, New York in 1921. His father was George Edgar Edens Sr., who was the director and probably the only teacher at the Palmerville Academy, which was on Palmerville Road in Palmerville, Stanley County, North Carolina. Dr. Edens graduated from high school in Elmhurst, New York, and then matriculated to Wake Forest College, which I guess was the forerunner of Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. He received a bachelor's degree in 1942, then went to medical school at Cornell University, and received his MD degree in 1945. He served a 1-year internship in internal medicine at Hartford Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut, and then joined the Navy and was the rank of lieutenant junior grade, stationed at a submarine base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then later was transferred to VA Hospital for tuberculosis in New York. After his discharge from the service, he went back and completed internal medicine training at Hartford, and his last year of training was at Central Maine General Hospital in Lewiston, Maine, after which he became an instructor in medicine for 1 year at Tufts University School of Medicine, called the New England Center Hospital. After that, he became the medical director for the Red Cross Bloodmobile program in the state of Connecticut, and then decided to return to Stanley County, where he had lived after he had, at some point in his growing up. And he began to practice internal medicine, solo practice, and established what was called the Albemarle Medical Clinic in 1951. Later, doctors Lou Kendall, Rufus Leffler joined the practice, and Dr. Edens retired from active practice in 1988, but he certainly left a good trail of his legacy. He was the closest thing to a cardiologist, if not a bona fide one, when in the time he was here. He did the first EKG in Stanley County and established the coronary care unit in 1952. He taught cardiopulmonary resuscitation later in his career. There was no such a thing until the 1960s, and he established as I said, the coronary care unit on the 4th floor of the Stanley County Hospital. And Stanley County Hospital was either the first or one of the first hospitals in North Carolina where all nursing personnel were certified in basic cardiac life support. He received the American Cancer Society Award for Stanley County's professional education program in 1978. He was actively interested in prevention and treatment of cancer and did the first pap smear and established the first pap smear program at the health department in Stanley County. Dr. Edens also was a benevolent donor and supporter of Stanley Community College or its predecessors, Stanley Technical Institute, etc., and also was a very ardent donor to Wake Forest University. He and his wife donated 45 acres of land in the country to the Girl Scouts to start a Camp Tarhelia. I think that's somewhere near Palestine, if it still exists. And he also was interested in skiing and horses and sailing. He often would make rounds early in the hospital on Wednesday morning and go drive up to Boone and ski and then come back and check in with his patients again on Wednesday evenings. Dr. Edens was inducted into the Order of the Longleaf, North Carolina Order of the Longleaf Pine in 2009, and he expired in 2012 at the age of 90. Take a little break from the big hitters. The next is Dr. Rufus Davis, the first Rufus to practice in Stanley County. Dr. Davis opened a general practice in Oakboro somewhere around 1950. Apparently, he did not stay long, as we could find no other information about him. Additionally, some of the mature Oakboro residents I spoke with had no recollection of him. And that's Dr. Rufus Davis.
They may say the same about us one day, Steve.
Next, Dr. Willis Richard Dick Ross. Dr. Ross was born in Kershaw County, South Carolina. I believe that was Gaskin territory, wasn't it?
Yes.
In 1924. At age 17, he volunteered to enlisted in the Army and eventually attained the rank of second lieutenant. After his discharge, he went to Clemson and then Auburn, undergraduate, and ended up graduating from the University of South Carolina in 1948. He went to medical school at the Medical College of South Carolina, now called the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, and graduated with his MD degree in 1952. Dr. Ross did internship at Columbia Hospital in Columbia, South Carolina, and then began practice thereafter in 1953. He assumed the practice of Dr. Lewis Gaskin, who had died suddenly, as Dr. Johnson mentioned in our first presentation. Dr. Ross was very interested in a number of diverse activities. He was a pilot. He was interested in his Scottish heritage. He reactivated the Clan Ross Association and chaired the first committee that drafted the first Clan Ross Articles of Incorporation. He made 2 trips to Scotland and was a member of the Scottish Heritage Society and a founding patron of the Loch Norman Highland Games, which I assume were at Loch Norman or Lake Norman. He was interested in supporting the Boy Scouts and was tapped for the Order of the Arrow. He was a Shriner in the local Shrine Lodge. He was a member of the Episcopalian Church. He and his wife Judy had, between them, 4 sons and a daughter, and 3 of them have passed on. And ironically, Judy Ross died just several days ago. Dr. Ross was a character, and I'm glad that I got to work with him. He was a hunter, and they loved Scottish Terrier dogs. They had a series of them. Time will prohibit us to go into great detail about some of the other activities that that we know about him and other doctors, so we'll move on. Dr. Ross, with Dr. Kelly, was one of the founders of Albemarle Family Medical Center, and Dr. Ross's private practice address is 123 North 1st Street, where Dr. Liz Gaskin was, and I think that's now part of that barber shop, isn't it? It's no longer an office?
It's still a clip joint.
Okay, going to move down the road 12 miles to Norwood. By the way, as you can tell, we're roughly in chronological order here. We may get a couple of them mixed up for reasons that makes it flow easier. We're trying to proceed in chronological order of the doctor's appearances in Stanley County. Dr. Willard Griggs was born in 1912 and served in the U.S. Navy in World War II. That is all we could learn about his education and training. He came to Norwood in the early 1950s and joined Dr. Lewis Mccloud in general practice. That union broke up after several years, and Dr. Griggs established a solo practice in Norwood until the last half of the 50s. Unfortunately, his health deteriorated, and he died at age 48 in 1960. His widow, Sarah Griggs, was a registered nurse who worked at Stanley County Hospital for years and was a long-term head nurse on the 4th floor of both the old and the new hospitals before retiring in the 1980s. Next, Dr. James Gray Tuttle. Dr. Tuttle was born in 1924 in Forsyth County, and he received his beginning education at Edwards Military Institute, wherever that is, and he went to undergraduate school at Duke, and he went to the University of North Carolina Medical School thereafter, but I believe that was just a 2-year school back then in the 1940s. He completed his medical education at Bowman Gray School of Medicine at Wake Forest, and then served internship and residencies in both pathology and internal medicine in Detroit. He also stayed on at Wayne State University Medical School in Detroit for a while after served as internal medicine instructor. His first job outside of training was in Western Tennessee, where he was a regional health officer. I don't know how long. In 1954, Tuttle came to Albemarle because his wife, the former Betty Hatley, had been a long-term native here. He opened up internal medicine practice and also served as a consultant to the staff of Montgomery and Anson County hospitals. He was a member of most of the medical organizations appropriate for his specialty, and also the Diabetic Association, the American Heart Association. He was a member of the Rotary Club, the Stanley County Country Club, and had written a number of articles and papers that were published in journals even after he was in practice. He was a member of the lay board of stewards at Main Street Methodist Church. He organized the first Stanley County Heart Council here in 1955 and was its president. He also served as president of the Stanley County chapter of Duke Alumni Association and was the chairperson of the Executive Development Committee of the Boy Scouts of America. Dr. Tuttle, unfortunately, was struck with multiple medical problems at an early age, and in late 1962, he had to retire from practice, and he passed on at Baptist Hospital, Winston-Salem, at the age of 39 in January of 1964, leaving behind his widow and a son and a daughter.
On Yadkin Street, that was the building with the gull wing roof, 222 Yadkin Street.
Okay, known as the Medical Arts Center, wasn't it? Please. We'll proceed more slowly if you can pick that up, please. Oh, do you need an adjustment? No, okay. Thank you. All right. Now we're back on focus. Time out to take a little break for a more updated timeline. We covered through 1954. In 1955, the former Stanley County home became the Stanley Rest Home, operated privately but under the auspices of the County Welfare Department. In 1955, the town of Stanfield became incorporated and swore in its inaugural mayor and councilman. In 1956, an 18-year-old Albemarle girl, Joan Melton, was crowned Miss North Carolina. In July 1956, radio station WZKY first went on the air. In February of 1957, the Albemarle, Collins, and Aikman plant opened. In November of 57, construction on the E.J. Snyder Dye and Textile Finishing Company began on Snug Street in Albemarle. In 1958, Albemarle erected its first stoplight. Anybody know where that was? Time's up.
North Street.
At the corner of Montgomery and North 2nd Street, not far from here. In August 1958, the present Albemarle High School building opened. In November 58, the Highway 27 bypass, no mention was made of Highway 24, was opened, and the Highway 52's route through Albemarle was relocated. I don't know the details on that. And also in 1958, the largest fire to date in Oakboro consumed the Little Theater, requiring 4 separate fire departments and over 100 firemen to extinguish. In September 59, local governments, offices, stores, and schools were closed for the first time in observance of Labor Day. In December 1959, Pfeiffer College became a accredited 4-year liberal arts college after having been a junior college. And also in 1959, United Mills opened a children's lingerie plant in Norwood.
What follows the underwear?
More doctors. Are you off key? No. All right. Can I proceed? In the mid to late 1950s, the 3 urologists of Salisbury Urology Clinic began to see patients in consultation on a part-time basis as outpatients at Stanley County Hospital. I could not discover if they consulted on hospitalized inpatients. Minor urological procedures such as cystoscopy, which is examining the bladder and urethra with a lighted instrument, were also performed. If a larger operation were needed, the patients were admitted to Rowan Hospital in Salisbury. The 3 doctors who rotated duties here were Dr. Norris Erb, Wayne Klein Sr., and Lloyd Pete Robertson. Dr. Erb grew up in Baden, and many patients were familiar with him and his family. This trio stopped seeing patients in Albemarle when the first full-time urologist established his practice here in 1964, and you'll hear about that shortly. I want to talk about the expansion of group practices. In part 1, we noted that virtually all the physicians born from 1850 to 1950 were in solo practice, and there were no groups of physicians practicing under one roof except for the rare incidents of a physician-child joining a physician-parent or a handful of informal associations of 2 doctors, such as a younger doctor working temporarily with a more experienced one. There were no professional associations, PAs, incorporations, LLCs, limited liability corporations, until the second half of the 20th century. The Salisbury Urology Group just mentioned was an early example of an association of physicians in the same building. In the 1950s, with advances in technology and the science of medicine itself, the need for bigger offices with rooms equipped for minor surgery and other procedures evolved, as well as the necessity for having adequate storage for supplies, workspace for increasing numbers of employees, and a break room or rooms. Concomitantly, with health insurance now playing a major role in paying patients' medical expenses, additional personnel were necessary to sort out charges and process claims. These developments led to the formation of partnerships and groups aligned in the same or multiple specialties to share expenses, particularly building, maintenance costs, equipment and supplies, and of course personnel. Additionally, caring for patients and addressing their concerns outside of office hours were more streamlined when associates in the same office could rotate these responsibilities rather than sharing call with doctors outside of the practice. Establishing or joining a group was not always the best option for a physician, however, whether he or she were new to the area or had already been in practice. Being part of a doctor team or partnership often led to disagreements about disparities in workload, practice styles, or income, and frequently physicians left and went solo or moved away. But from the late 50s forward, medical groups were here to stay in Stanley County as well as nationally. Nonetheless, many of the doctors we're highlighting this evening enjoyed years of running a solo practice which suited their personal needs and goals as well as those of their patients very well. Moving on with doctors of the last part of the 1950s, Claude Newton Ballinger Jr. Dr. Ballinger was born in 1927 on New Year's Eve in Alexandria, Virginia, and he received his early education in that city. He matriculated at the University of Virginia and graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1948, and then stayed on to get a Master of Science in Basic Sciences, which sounds like preparation for teaching, at UVA in 1949. Thereafter, he did a one-year fellowship in biochemistry at the National Institute of Health in the Laboratory of Enzymes and Nutrition in Bethesda, Maryland, and then was admitted to medical school at University of Virginia in Charlottesville, graduating in 1954. Dr. Ballinger did an internship in internal medicine at the UVA hospital, and then decided to pursue pediatrics. For the next 2 years, he was a resident in pediatrics at the St. Louis Children's Hospital in St. Louis, and was also a clinical instructor at Washington University School of Medicine, St. Louis. After that, Dr. Ballinger was inducted in the military service into the Army and served from 1957 to 1959 as the chief of the pediatric outpatient department and newborn nursery at William Beaumont Army Hospital in El Paso, Texas. I believe I see somebody there that was stationed at Beaumont or at El Paso. I see it right, Bubba Hesley. Okay. A little bit later than that. In 1959, Dr. Ballinger elected to become the first full-time practicing pediatrician in Stanley County, and he opened his office in Albemarle at that time. Dr. Ballinger was involved in a lot of activities during his practice years. From 1973 to 1982, he was a college physician at Pfeiffer College, and he has a whole list of duties, directorships, and both for pay and nonprofit, just many that are too many to name. He was a medical director of the Child Health Clinic at Stanley County Health Department for years. He's the medical director of the Stanley County Home for Autistic Children. He was on the Stanley Board of Health at least once, and the list of his awards and accomplishments were legion. He developed declining health in the 1980s and eventually retired in 1989, and he estimated in the 30 years as a practice he had taken care of 10,000 newborn infants. And Dr. Ballinger died in 1997 at the age of 69, leaving behind a wife and I think 2 children. All yours, Dr. J.
Well, you're a tough act to follow, Dr. Seltzer. Okay, we got a few more. My list is a little shorter because those who can do and those who can't, we get a short list. My first doctor I want to talk about is Dr. William Lewis Mccloud, a legend in his own time. Born in 1914 in Bowie's Creek, North Carolina, and the creek is still there. Dr. Talley, who practiced here, is also from Bowie's Creek, a little older. Dr. Mccloud went to Bowie's Creek Academy to high school. He went to Campbell College for 2 years and then transferred to Wake Forest College, which was then in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and graduated in 1934. Went to medical school at Temple University in Philadelphia and graduated in 1938. Did an internship at City Memorial Hospital in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That is now Forsyth County Hospital. Then he went into practice. Since it's hard to make any money back then, he became the school doctor at Campbell College for a year and then moved to Norwood in 1941. World War II broke out and he enlisted, and he served in the United States Army in World War II. After that, he came back to Norwood. Dr. R.V. Lyles, who is sitting back there. Hi, Dr. Lyles. Joined him in 1961, by the way. His first wife, Margaret, died in 1965, and Dr. Mccloud moved to Paris, Kentucky for about a year. He loved horses and Maker's Mark. He returned to Oakboro. He returned to North Carolina in 1966. The town of Oakboro offered him a free office. And I understand that the first day that he showed up there, that the cars were lined up for 3 blocks because they all wanted to see Dr. Mccloud. He was a legendary physician. He delivered a lot of babies, and his legend, and Dr. Gator will attest to this, was called Slickum. It was green soap that as the baby was coming out, he'd lather up the baby's head and just slide that baby on out. Give me some Slickum. And of course, he, just as Dr. Seltzer said, and I'm not going to enumerate all the duties that these dear old people did. I got a legendary phone call probably about 1985. I had a busy morning, and my nurse said, Dr. Mccloud's on the phone, so I went and got it. He said, this is Lewis. I got this old boy out here. I think he need a little tune-up. You mind if I send him up your way? I said, no, Dr. Mccloud, that's fine. My waiting room is full. Why don't you send him to the emergency room, and I'll catch up with him later. It was one of those days you worked through lunch, and it was about 5:45. My beeper went off, and it said, call the ICU. And I yelled to my nurse, Rita Thompson. I said, Rita, I don't have anyone up in ICU. Go check this. So she came back and said, it's the patient Dr. Mccloud sent in. I found out that the old boy would just need a tune-up. As he got to the hospital, he collapsed at the entrance to the emergency room, full cardiopulmonary arrest. They had to resuscitate him, brought him up to the ICU, and anyway, Dr. Mccloud was not available when I tried to give him a little follow-up for that. Dear old Dr. Mccloud, he loved Tennessee walking horses, and I've seen pictures of him on there. And he had that beautiful home out on Lake Tillery, where the large pasture was, but it's not there anymore. I've got a picture. This is taken from sometime in the mid-'80s. I was the president of Stanley County Medical Society, and I'm handing Dr. Mccloud his 50-year certificate as a member of the North Carolina Medical Society. Incredible career. Very briefly, John Paschall, who practiced here a long time, but his family is gone now, and we couldn't find much on him. He was born in 1916. He passed away in 1977. He went to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland to medical school and did his residency in my wife's hometown of Detroit. He did serve in the armed services in both France and Germany as a surgeon. He came to Albemarle in 1950, where he practiced general surgery. He was in a solo practice until 1968, when he formed the Albemarle Surgical Clinic with Dr. Freeman and Dr. Smith. He was one of the doctors out at Alcoa, and he was also the first medical director at North Carolina Lutheran Home. Oh, that's Dr. Mccloud. I just did that. What's that, hardening the arteries thing again? Okay, yeah, hardening the arteries, thank you. Next is William Harrison Freeman, known as Joe Freeman, born 1922 in Leakesville. Now, I guess if you're from Leakesville, you're probably either going to be a plumber or a urologist, but not Dr. Freeman. Leakesville then merged with some other towns to become Eden, North Carolina. His dad was a railroad conductor. He went to Wake Forest College. He was 16 when he started, and his buddies back home nicknamed him Joe College, and that's how he got the nickname Joe Freeman. Anyway, at least he told me that. It might have been something else. He went to med school at Bowman Gray, and back then it was during World War II, and instead of being 4 years, they got the doctors out in 3 years, and their internship, instead of 1 year, shortened to 9 months. He went into the United States Navy in June of 1945, a good time to go in the Navy because the war was almost over. He served 10 months in the Pacific, and let's see, what else did I write? Oh, yeah, he told me one thing he loved about being in the service when he was up in New York in his training, and he used to go to the Savoy Ballroom, which was a big band place at that time, and he got to see people like Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman in person. His first practice was a general practice in Warsaw, North Carolina. In 1946, he practiced there for 2 years. He did a surgery residency in 1948 to 51 in the old Watts Hospital in Durham, which is now Durham County Hospital. He had a military recall in the Korean conflict, and he spent that at Camp Lejeune. Then he came in 1952, came to Albemarle as a solo surgeon. Doctors W.I. Shaver and Dennis Fox, they did cross cover for him. In 1968, the Albemarle Surgical Clinic with Dr. John Paschall and Whitman Smith was formed. Later, Dr. Bruce Barron joined that clinic. Back then, again, as I said, these guys did ENT, thoracic, abdominal. They did about everything as far as that surgeons would do. His interests were mainly business. He knew how to make money. He was a very shrewd real estate investor, and he also was on the forefront of developing nursing homes, because what is now Stanley Manor was originally called Swan Ridge. He had a lot to do with the forming up there. His wife was Evelyn, but does anyone remember what he called her? Chicken, that's right. I didn't call her Chicken. I called her Miss Freeman. Though Dr. Freeman told me this story one time. told me of a patient that had been badly mauled on the foot by the neighbor's cat a few days earlier. And he came in, he had this nasty infection, and Dr. Freeman said it was the worst case of pussyfoot he'd ever seen. Now, next, keep an eye out for this guy, was Reid Gaskin. Born in Wadesboro, North Carolina, where his father Lewis practiced down in Wadesboro. They moved to Albemarle in 1932 because his father, his uncle John Stover Gaskin Sr. was practicing here, and so he moved up to the land of milk and honey. Dr. Reid Gaskin graduated from Albemarle High School in 1942. He also went to Wake Forest to college, and then to medical school in Atlanta at Emory University. Emory University School of Medicine, I'll get that correct. In 1953, he started doing an internship in Greenville General Hospital. That's in Greenville, South Carolina. And his father, as Dr. Seltzer said, died suddenly. And he had to come back and leave his internship. And you could get a license back then to practice much more easily. And he filled in for his father's practice, and he did not want to work hard and be a GP like his daddy was. So, unfortunately, Dr. Richard Ross came along and took over that practice. He then went back to Grady for hospital in Atlanta for some more training, and then in 1956 went to the Illinois Eye, Ear, Nose, Throat Infirmary in Chicago, where he actually at one time you became an eye, ear, nose, throat doctor and not just an ophthalmologist or ENT. And that was up in Chicago. Then he moved back to North Carolina, on Randolph Road. He had a clinic, and he came here to 109 Penny Lane. Was that named for the Beatles song? I do not know. He had a chauffeur. Okay, he was a great businessman too. And when he came to Albemarle, he had a chauffeur who drove, and Dr. Gaskin would sit in the back seat doing all his business arrangements. Wasted no time. He did a lot of cataract surgery, and the first one really to use laser surgery and do lens implants here. Very briefly, Jim Bivens, whose father, Dr. Ed Bivens, was the first radiologist. Jim typed this out for me. And Dr. Bivens was born in Wadesboro. His dad passed away when he was only 12. The family moved to Gastonia, and he had to help support the family with the paper route. He worked his way through Davidson College, waiting tables, and graduated in 1937. He went to UNC School of Public Health and earned enough money to go to medical school, where he worked as a Cabarrus County sanitarian. He also got married and had 2 sons. He went then to Bowman Gray Medical School and completed his internship at North Carolina Baptist Hospital in 1947. Where then they went and had twin boys. Why not? He served as assistant radiologist and Harvard professor in 1948 and chief resident in radiology in 1949. He got a fellowship in radiology at another hospital in Boston called Peter Bent Brigham from 50 to 51, and he moved to Albemarle in 1952, where he became the first full-time radiologist. During that time, he also worked in Wadesboro and other places. During his stay in Albemarle, Dr. Bivens was a community leader. He was involved with Chamber of Commerce, Rotary Club, and others. He then got divorced, moved to Atlanta, where he had a distinguished career as a renowned mammographer. The first pathologist here, his name was John Johnson. Johnson spelled S-O-N the funny way. Dr. Whit Smith is the only one who even knew about him. We find nothing else that he practiced here sometime around 1951. That's all I can say about him. And now one of Dr. Seltzer's neighbors, George Richie Wall, born August 11th, 1916 in Lylesville. You know where Lylesville is? Anyone out there? Anyway, he was raised in Siler City, did his undergrad at Chapel Hill, went to med school at Chapel Hill for 2 years, and again, as Dr. Seltzer said, it was only a 2-year school back then. He finished at Duke and graduated then. He was a Rhodes Scholar. I did not know that. And he got to go to St. Bartholomew's Hospital in Oxford, England, Oxford University. he then did a residency at the Maryland Medical Hospital for 3 years, and then in World War II, he joined the U.S. Army Medical Corps, where he was a major. Also had two brothers who also served in World War II. He married Claudia Harris. Now, Claudia's father was the physician for Barnum Bailey Circus. Now, he just treated people, all the, trapeze people. I guess he probably treated lion bites and all kinds of things.
Clowns.
Clowns. Thank you. Anyway, he opened a general practice in Albemarle in March of 45 and practiced until his death. Very sadly, I was told this, that while practicing, he developed acute abdominal pain and went next door to see Dr. Freeman, and Dr. Freeman realized that he was having a condition called mesenteric thrombosis, where you have blood clots in the blood vessels in your intestines. It's usually fatal. And he lasted about a week. They couldn't save him. Died at the young age of 62. He did do missionary work in Guatemala, which he found to be a very rewarding experience. And Dr. Seltzer's other neighbor over there, Joseph Alderman Ross. We're getting another Anson County native. Born in 1926 in Wadesboro. He got his name Joseph by their admired family doctor, Dr. Joseph Bennett. His mom was a nurse in Wadesboro. He graduated from Wadesboro High School in 1944. What do you think guys who graduated in 1944 did? They went in the service. And he went just as a young 18-year-old boy, a machine gun squad, went to Central Europe. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, and that always gives me chills when I read about anyone who had to go through that. After he got out of the Army, he went to Duke undergrad and then Emory in Atlanta for his medical degree and graduated in 54. Postgraduate, he did further studies at Grady, which is a hospital affiliated with Emory Hospital. It's the general hospital in Atlanta, and also at Greenville General in South Carolina. He married Betty Hargrove while he was at Grady. He practiced in Albemarle from 1957 to 87, doing the full family practice. After that, he worked at the VA hospital in Salisbury until 1944. He also was at college. After Dr. Ballinger, he became the college physician at Pfeiffer. He died at the age of 73. Now, I found this out from his widow. In World War II, he sustained a serious hand laceration while in combat, and there were no medics nearby. He had to sew himself up. And this I did not know either. In 1960, he was diagnosed with testicular cancer. He didn't tell anyone except his family. And he would go to Durham for treatments and come back and practice. I don't know how the guy was tough enough to do that, due to his strength of character and dedication to his patients. I'm very grateful to Dr. Ross. I inherited a lot of wonderful patients from him. And my last one of the 50s, the new doctors who showed up here in the 50s, is Dr. William Henry Hill, born in Albemarle in 1920. His father, William Isaac Hill, practiced in Stanley County from 1898 to 1951. Dr. Hill, younger, graduated from Albemarle High School in 38. He also went to Wake Forest. We got a pattern there. Bowman Gray School of Medicine, again, 3 years long because of the war. Interned at Rex Hospital in Raleigh for 9 months. He was on active duty in the Army till 1946, then came back to Albemarle. He practiced in the Hill Building, which Pinnacle Bank is now where the Hill Building is. That used to be a place where a lot of pigeons used to live there. Kept the sidewalks painted white around there. And again, he had a general practice, loved by his patients. And I fortunately inherited a lot of his wonderful patients when he retired in 87. His wife, Edith, and he had children, Mary Ellen, William Henry Hill Jr., Edward Lee, and Virginia Lynn. He was a staunch member of First Baptist Church. And he and Dr. Wall and Dr. Joe Ross all cross-covered. And that is the last of the 1950s. Whew.
It picks up because the younger doctors weren't here as long and weren't as famous.
I was supposed to say this. And now the 1960s. Remember JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., Neil Armstrong, and the Beatles.
Yeah.
Don't egg him on. Do not.
Okay. A boy comes into the office. The doctor says, "What can I help you with?" He says, "I want to talk about my sister." He said, "She thinks she's a chicken." And he says, "Well, that's interesting. When did this begin?" He said, "About 3 years ago." He said, "Why didn't you bring her in sooner?" He said, "Well, we needed the eggs." Started with community events in the early 60s. In May 1961, the restored Crone Homestead at Morrow Mountain was dedicated. In 62, the community high schools in the county consolidated into three larger county high schools. Initial enrollment was 77 students larger than the start of school a year before. For the record, in 1962, in its inaugural years, South Stanley had 492 students, West Stanley 599, North Stanley 624. In March 1962, the three funeral homes providing ambulance service ceased operation, and Albemarle businessman Max Festerman began providing the service to local citizens. In November 1962, Louder Hardware opened their sports center on West Main Street in Albemarle. In 1963, in April, the Wisconsin Memorial YMCA opened its first indoor swimming pool. In October of '63, Allendale Furniture Manufacturing opened in a new building near Stanfield. In February 1964, Winn-Dixie announced plans to occupy a new store just east of the Five Points intersection in Albemarle. In August 1964, Hotel Albemarle closed its doors due to violations of the state building code. In May 1964, Stanley County's first automatic car wash, Boone's Self-Service Car Wash, opened on North 2nd Street in Albemarle in the Happy Hollow era. What's next? Do I keep going?
Let me see. I wrote this down. Did you finish the timeline?
Yes.
Okay, that is Dr. J is doing medical breakthroughs. Let's see. 1960, CPR was finally approved. And as Dr. Seltzer mentioned, Stanley County Hospital became the first hospital in the state where all the RNs were CPR trained. Birth control pills, 1960. I don't know if they're still in use or not. The oral polio in 1962, or the sugar cube. Do I have time to tell the holy poly, Judy? Okay, I have to tell you this. My youngest son Kenny, he was 5. We were going to Harris Teeter one night, and he got to talking about what happens when you die. And I said, well, when you die, you don't need your body anymore, and your spirit, your soul goes up to live with God. And Kenny said, well, if you drink the holy poly, you'll never die. I said, well, Kenny, could you tell me what the holy poly is? You go to Dr. Jolly's office, and Miss Kirk, his nurse, she squeezes the holy poly in your mouth, and if you drink the holy poly, you'll never get sick, and if you never get sick, you'll never die. And so then I figured out the holy poly was the oral polio vaccine told through the lips of a 5, who is now a physician, by the way. Okay. In 1962, the first hemodialysis centers were opened. In 1963, the first portable defibrillators. In other words, you could have a crash cart now. And in 1964, excuse me, I just got to take a little break here. In 1964, boy, those are good. The Surgeon General reported that cigarettes could cause lung cancer. What do they know, huh? In 1964, also, from a sewer in Sardinia, a bacteria was extracted from that. They grew an antibiotic called Keflin. You know, of course, that penicillin came from a mold, and Keflin was the first of what are called cephalosporins. You may have heard of Keflex. Well, I saved one pill, and I'll tell you, this is a wonder drug. Can you see that, Dr. Lyles? This is a wonder drug, because I told my patients, you take one of these and you'll have no more problems. Okay, well, let's see. Quit clowning around. Measles vaccine, 1964. 1964, a miracle drug for people who had congestive heart failure. They were filled up with fluids. They were swelling. It's called Lasix, and it would save lives. They did not have any effective diuretics before that time. Measles, I said measles. Did I mention the hardening of the arteries, Dr. Seltzer? Okay. In 1967, an obscure South African surgeon named Christian Bernard did a heart transplant into a human being. 1968, ultrasound was developed, and that's what you check things like gallbladders and check the baby down here and doing echocardiograms. Wonderful, wonderful instrument. 1968, a wonder drug came out called Valium. Valium by 1978 was the biggest selling medicine in the United States. Over 2 billion pills of Valium were sold that year. During the 60s, they closed the state mental hospitals for a few reasons, but one, that good medicines for psychosis and schizophrenia and depression, medicines like Elavil and Thorazine had been developed, and they could close many of these hospitals. Let's see, am I running through mine already here, Dr. Seltzer? Let me get another draw on my cigarette. Yeah, those are medical breakthroughs. It's all yours.
A fellow encountered was a victim of a very serious accident. While walking on the street, he was run over by a steamroller, and he had numerous injuries, and he was rushed to the hospital. His family came to see him. He had to have extensive surgery, but he was recovering, and they didn't know what room he was in, so they stopped at the desk and said, "Is this Mr. Smith? What room is he in? We'd like to go visit him." And the nurse at the desk says, "Well, he's in room 201, 203, 205, 207, and 209. We're into the 60s now, and our first doctor is sitting in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th row, Dr. Richard V. Dick Lyles, Jr. Dick was born in Wadesboro, that's in Anson County, and was raised there. He graduated from Wadesboro High School in 1949. In high school, he was the sports editor and co-business manager of the student Prince, P-R-I-N-T-S, and he lettered in football and basketball. He was also deemed in his senior yearbook as being the most likely to succeed, and he gained Eagle Scout status in 1947. He matriculated to Davidson College and graduated in 1953 with a bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry, and was the sports editor of the Davidsonian. He also was in the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity, was assistant football trainer and a basketball trainer. He went to medical school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and graduated in 1957, and thereafter did a rotating internship at the University of Alabama Medical Center in Birmingham, and 6 months of residency tacked onto that for better training. Then he enlisted in Uncle Sam's Armed Forces in the Navy and became a general medical officer and diving officer stationed in Japan in Yokosuka Naval Hospital and Yokohama Dispensary. And he spent 2.5 years there from early 1959 till June of 61. Upon release from the service, he practiced in Norwood, started in 1961 with Dr. Lewis Mccloud for several years, and then solo from 1961 to 1976. He was admitting patients to Stanley Hospital at that time, delivering babies, making house calls, making hospital rounds, seeing patients in the emergency room, and eventually Dr. Lyles elected to leave Norwood and join Albemarle Family Medical Center when one of its founders, Dr. John Gaskin Jr., withdrew from the group. That was in 1976. And he stayed with Albemarle Family Medical Center until he retired in 1995. And I was a recipient of Dr. Lyles and Dr. Ross retiring on the same day, July 1st, 1995. Dr. Lyles was a very active member in the First Presbyterian Church of Norwood, and then later in the First Presbyterian Church in Albemarle. He was very active in the American Academy of Family Physicians and the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians, and was president of the latter organization in 1980. He's married, but his wife, unfortunately, has passed on. He has 2 children. His son, Greg, has passed on. His daughter, Abby, is sitting right next to him. Because of some health problems, Dick was no longer able to live alone, and he moved to Charlotte to be close to Abby. He was a real Southern gentleman and harked back to the past in many ways. He loved to hunt and fish and play golf, and he loved to visit his retreat in rural Anson County, somewhere near White Store or McFarland, one of those bends in the road, and he loved to spend his weekends there. The trademarks that Dick possesses are, first of all, a yellow-green Lincoln, and then later a white pickup truck with a Vandy license plate Lyles, usually parked askew, so that it took up more than one parking place, and his ever-present, at least back then, cigar. So I was fortunate to have known and to work with him, and I'm very happy that he's come to all the events we've given before. So I think he's the oldest member that's still alive that we're talking about today, and I believe, if my math is correct, well, maybe it's incorrect. Are you really going to be 91 years old in July? How about that?
I'm going to just, Doc, if I may interject, to my 3 boys, I said the working definition is unflappable as Dr. R.V. Lyles. The guy never changed his disposition. It was always the same.
Okay, we're going to change gears for just a moment here. Let's talk a little bit about the administrators at Stanley County and Stanley Memorial Hospital. Prior to the 1950s, doctors ran hospitals, but things became more complex, and it became clear that they needed somebody else to be able to manage personnel, patient issues, public issues, employees, and doctors. So that's when hospital administrators became a specialty. First, anybody that had any kind of training past high school qualified, then later it developed its own curriculum with a master's degree and that sort of thing. For the first 3 weeks Stanley County Hospital was open, there was no administrator. In August of 1949, Joseph Lennon assumed the job for 2 years. In 1951, a Robert Gant took over for 4 years. In 1955, C.J. Price, who went by Jack, came and stayed till 1962. Then Crenshaw Thompson came here in September of 1962 and left in June of 1973, replaced after 9 months of interim leadership by various people, by Don Logan, who left in 1984 and was replaced by Ken Shull, who was here for 4 years. I want to read you something. At 12:38 p.m. on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally were brought to the emergency room of Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas, after being struck down by the bullets of an assassin. At 1:07 p.m., Sunday, November 24th, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald, accused assassin of the late president and assailant of the governor, died in an operating room at Parkland Memorial Hospital after being shot by a bystander in the basement of Dallas City Hall. That was Jack Ruby. In the intervening 48 hours and 31 minutes, Parkland Memorial Hospital had, number 1, become the temporary seat of government of the United States. Number 2, become the temporary seat of the government of the state of Texas. Number 3, became the site of the death of the 35th president. Number 4, became the site of ascendancy of the 36th president. Number 5, became the site of death of the President Kennedy's accused assassin. Number 6, twice became the center of the attention of the world. And number 7, continued to function at close to normal pace at a large charity hospital. This was written by the hospital administrator, Jack Price, who got his training at Stanley County Hospital before he went to Parkland in Dallas. A small world incident. Now, getting back to the real world of the physicians, 1964 saw the entrance of the Stanley County's first full-time urologist, Dr. Robert Kent Dyer. Dr. Dyer was born in 1926 in Pulaski, Virginia, and went to public schools in Roanoke. He went to college at Hampden-Sydney College, a private school in the eastern part of the state. He graduated with a bachelor's degree, cum laude, in 1949, and went to medical school at Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, graduating in 1953. He did his residency in urology at one of the most interesting hospitals in the United States, Charity Hospital of New Orleans. If you can't see it there, it doesn't exist. And he has urology training there. After 1964, he practiced somewhere in Virginia I take that back. He graduated after his residency in 57. He practiced in Virginia for 7 years. I don't know where. Then came to Albemarle in 1964, and that ended the Salisbury urologist clinic visits here. Dr. Dyer practiced in Albemarle till 1986. Then he moved his practice to Troy. He was there for a while, and then he moved somewhere else in the Chesapeake, Virginia area. And I think he retired there, and he moved to Hendersonville, North Carolina, in retirement. His wife was Mary Jim Dyer. They had a son and a daughter. Dr. Dyer lived the last part of his career at Albemarle on Melker Road in the Melker Heights area, and he died 17 days short of his 90th birthday in Hendersonville, North Carolina in 1916. Robert Bob Dyer.
1916.
2016, sorry. We've done a lot of things. We can't get people to die before they're born. Francis Weatherly Frank Greene, appropriately born on St. Patrick's Day in 1931 in Chicago. I'm not certain what his father did.
He's a professor.
Was he? His father was a professor? Okay, and I believe he shares a birthday with you, right, Bob? Anyway, 6 months after, when Frank was 6 months old, they moved to North Dakota. And then they moved from North Dakota when he was 14 to Charlotte. And he had his high school in education in Charlotte. And he entered the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1949 and was able to graduate in 3 years in Phi Beta Kappa, and then went to medical school at Chapel Hill and graduated in 1956. Dr. Greene did his internship at Chapel Hill from 1956 to 1957. Then Uncle Sam called, and he spent 3 years in the Army Medical Corps until 1960. After that, he did internal medicine residency at North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem from July of 61 to 1964, and then entered private practice here. I wanted to briefly mention that after Dr. James Tuttle died, his practice was taken over by Dr. William Herring. This was in 1963, no kin to Dr. John Herring. Dr. William Herring was an internist who had an interest in hematology, and he really wasn't cut out for private practice. He practiced here less than a year and moved into academic medicine, and Dr. Greene took over that practice then in 1964. What is significant about Dr. Herring is he became the director of medical education at Moses Cone Hospital in Greensboro, where I applied for a residency position after my internship, hoping to get into the second level year of a 3-year program. Well, they were filled, and Dr. Herring said, "No thanks, don't need you." Well, I was scratching my head trying to decide what to do next, and he called me, and I'd never met the man except for a brief interview. He said, "I've got a slot for you because somebody has unexpectedly dropped out." And when I got to Greensboro, he was a strict taskmaster as an instructor, although he was helpful to the residents with hematology problems. And he ended up continuing in that role as a faculty member, but not the director of the program, and retired sometimes in the 90s. Dr. William Herring, he and his wife were big supporters of UNC Greensboro and endowed a garden on that campus called the Elizabeth Herring Memorial Garden. So he's not a red herring. He really did exist. Getting back to Dr. Greene, he practiced in Albemarle for a number of years, like 1964 to 2003. That's 39 years. And he was a character, as you know. He was, before we had anyone formally trained in hematology, he was a cancer specialist and gave chemotherapy. I think Dr. Edens formerly dabbled in that, but the field really expanded in the 60s and 70s. Dr. Greene was also very astute at reading EKGs and managing cardiology, and he had his quirks, but he spent a lot of time at the hospital, and you could always recognize when he was there because he had that 1971 white Buick Riviera with black trim with a dog in the front seat, and Dr. Greene carried a lineman's toolbox toolkit around his waist, a tool belt with a stethoscope and I think a hacksaw and pliers, maybe a defibrillator, wrenches, and one time his tool belt was stolen and he had a full-fledged panic attack. It was recovered after that. He had a temper, but his efforts were always directed on the patient's behalf. And he was, to say he was a ardent Carolina Tar Heel is not strong enough to describe him. I will tell you that he did have some health problems and necessitated time away from the office. And he sent a lot of patients. In fact, even though there were specialists in this community and also in Concord and Charlotte, he preferred to refer patients that needed specialists to Baptist Hospital, where he knew the physicians. And I was told that he referred more patients to Baptist Hospital than any other physician in the state. And so when he became ill, and when you're in solo practice and can't practice, you have to make arrangements for your patients to be seen. And instead of hiring somebody or trying to depend on friends and associates who may not be motivated, Baptist Hospital sent internal medicine residents and fellows down here at no charge to man Dr. Greene's office till he could return. So I think that's a credit to how much he believed in Baptist Hospital. He was hard to get to know, but he had a sense of humor, and I enjoyed him very much, but you wouldn't want to cross him. He was very persnickety about how he prepared his iced tea and about the orders at the nurse's station. He was colorblind, so they had to mark his charts with big black masking tape. Everybody else had a color. You know, some were blue, some were red, you know, some were green, but Dr. Greene had to have big black tape put on the front of his charts. So he was a character. After retirement, he and his wife, Mary, enjoyed some years of retirement. Both developed health problems. They had 4 children, and Dr. Greene died in 2020 at the age of 89. John Morris Jack Wallace, first full-time pathologist in Stanley County. Dr. Wallace was born in Iowa in 1931. Family moved to Colorado, and he graduated from high school in Denver in 1949. He attended Princeton University, received a bachelor's degree in 1953, then went to medical school at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston and graduated in 1959. He did a rotating internship at the University of Florida Hospital in 1959-60, and then a pathology residency at Charlotte Memorial Hospital, it was called back then, from 1960 to 1964, and he became the first full-time pathologist here at Stanley Hospital in 1964. He was certified in both anatomic and clinical pathology. That's remarkable. Clinical is lab test, anatomic is autopsies and biopsies and such. And he held a number of positions in professional organizations, including blood banking and other. He was a perpetual delegate from Stanley County to North Carolina Medical Society. He also served, as we all did, various offices in the hospital staff and in the medical society. He enjoyed boating and fishing, and he was the medical director, or the medical examiner for a number of years, and also did this for Anson County. At one time, he left Stanley County for a short time. I don't remember when it was. Do you remember when it was, Dr. Gay? For about a year, sometime in the 80s, and then he came back. I don't know what we did in the interim, but he retired about 2000 or so. He was about 70 at that time, and for a while he lived on the lake in Norwood and enjoyed fishing and boating. His health deteriorated. I think he ended up living in Georgia. He had 2 daughters and a son. And I take that back, 2 sons and a daughter, and he died in 2021 in hospice care in Brunswick, Georgia. Jack Wallace. He was one of those people that you didn't know who he was, but you got a bill from somebody that never saw you. The end of the 60s, In February 1966, Stanley County Mental Health Center opened in the former nurses' residence at the hospital. In September of 66, Quenby Mall, constructed by Dr. E.P. Brunson, who we talked about last time, opened. In February 67, the Albemarle Post Office opened on South First Street, the new post office. In June of 68, direct distance dial-in for all customers of the Concord Telephone Company began. Also in August 1968, the Yellow Top Cab Company began ambulance service in Stanley County from its headquarters in the former Red Star service station on East Main Street. Anybody remember those? I don't. I wasn't here. In October of 68, the police department in Albemarle relocated to the former post office on North 2nd Street. In February of 69, the county's first ABC store opened in Norwood after voters approved same 4 months before. 1969, in October, groundbreaking was held for the construction of the new Stanley County Hospital. A few doctors came to town in the latter part of the 60s. Addison Goodloe Mangum. Dr. Addison Mangum was born in Gastonia and went to high school there. And he was born in 1933. He went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for undergraduate and for medical school, graduated in 1958, and began a residency at Duke, a residency in radiology. And he finished in 1962. He spent 3 years in the United States Air Force and then came to be the second radiologist at Stanley County Hospital in 1965, replacing Dr. Edward Bivens, who Dr. Johnson has described. We don't know much about Dr. Mangum. He was unmarried. He was sort of quiet, stayed to himself. He did have a home at the beach, and later on he lived on Holbrook Court. He had a billing office right next to Albemarle Women's Clinic on North 5th Street, but he really, we didn't know much about him, really. He was unmarried. He didn't have children or close family members, and he developed health problems later in life, and he died at Stanley Manor Nursing Home in 2012 at the age of 78. The interesting thing about Dr. Mangum is that his estate, which is quite large, the bulk of it was devoted to the North Carolina Zoo Society. And nobody seemed to understand why, because he had expressed no opinions or liking, or was not known to be a donor before. And what was formerly called the Sonoran Desert exhibit in the zoo is now called the Addison G. Mangum Sonoran Zoo. And it has a wide variety of desert-type plants and some animals. It's worth seeing. And I think it's even more interesting that, hey, I knew the guy that endowed this. And Addison Goodloe Mangum, he retired in 1983, and we'll get to the story about radiologists thereafter. A few more tidbits for the last part of the 60s, and I realize we're approaching late in the evening. You might be able to call DoorDash and get a snack if you want. George Libby. Dr. George Libby was very well educated and came to Albemarle to lead the Stanley County Health Department in 1966. As we heard in part one, Dr. Nash McKenzie was the first physician director until he resigned in 1945 due to the volume of patients in his private practice. Another physician, Dr. M.B. Bethel, assumed this role on a part-time basis, although we do not have a record of his tenure. He was followed by Dr. Frank Wilson, who is not to be confused with the lead singer of J. Frank Wilson, the Cavaliers, who recorded the sappy ballad Last Kiss in 1964, being an ex-DJ, I caught that. And that Dr. Wilson's stint started sometime in 1947 and ended when Dr. Robert Fox, who we talked about last time, arrived in 48. Dr. Fox left in 62, was replaced by Dr. Edward Humphrey, unknown if he was related to the senator and later Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And Dr. Libby assumed the directorship in August 1, 1966, and served 8 years before retiring. Dr. Libby remained active as a consultant to the department after his retirement, and he was the final full-time physician director of this organization. He had a special interest in polio immunization and led numerous campaigns to vaccinate all Stanley County children. He relinquished his consultant role in the 1980s. Dr. Libby and his wife lived on Honeysuckle Lane in Albemarle, and unfortunately we could find no further details about his life and career, nor any information about his later life, although he passed away at some point in the latter 20th century. Completing the 1960s rundown, we have Dr. William O. Jolly. Dr. William Oscar Jolly III was born in 1936 in Gastonia, but was raised in Ayden, North Carolina, a small town near Greenville. He went to elementary and high school there and graduated in 1955. He entered the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 55, graduated May of 59, then went to medical school at the same institution. After his graduation in 1963, he served internship at Norfolk General Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia for 1 year and stayed on for additional years, serving a 1-year residency. That takes him up to 1965, where he spent 2 years in the Air Force, most of which he was stationed in Alabama. And after he was released from the Air Force in 1967, he joined Albemarle Family Medical Center, which at that time he joined Dr. Lyles, Dr. Ross, and Dr. John Gaskin. In 1989, Dr. Jolly left Albemarle Family Medical Center and opened a solo practice over in Stanley Medical Plaza, which he remained into his retirement in 2005. He was an ardent supporter of the North Carolina Tar Heels, also like many others, served various roles on the staff of the Stanley County Hospital and the Stanley County Medical Society, and he was active in First Presbyterian Church in Albemarle and enjoyed gardening, fishing, and photography. He is married to Nancy Jolly and has 2 sons and 1 daughter. And I have spoken more about Dr. Jolly than he ever spoke to me in all those years. Some people said he was named Jolly because he never laughed, but he was a very good physician, and once you got to know him, especially if you asked him about Carolina, he could talk your ear off. According to my sheet here, Dr. Johnson, you're up next.
My voice is well rested. Just a few things about management of a hospital. Every usually 3 years we get an inspection from the Joint Commission of Accreditation of Hospitals, and the hospital has to meet certain standards to get accredited. It's a non-government inspection, but that in the 60s became a part that should remain accredited hospital. Our hospital always attained that. We had to have a lot of committees in the hospital that we served without any pay or thanks or anything. One was credentials committee, so that when someone applies to be a doctor on the staff, you have to make sure they have the proper training, they haven't had any problems with abuse of drugs or other things, because those people, you want to get rid of those rotten eggs and don't let them on your staff. There's peer review committees. If something happened, there was a complaint against a physician, we had to review it and see what went on. Blood banking, you didn't want to waste blood. You had to, every unit of blood that was passed, you had to approve that it was used without wasting it. That's very short. Dr. Whitman Erskine Smith Jr., born in 1931, who is a little older than Dr. Lyles, but not much. His dad was a prominent attorney in town, and his mama was a real sweetheart. He went to Webb School in Bell Buckle, Tennessee, which sounds like a country western song to me. Went to college at Duke and went to medical school there. Trained some for about a year at St. Thomas Hospital, London, England, and then went back to Duke where he did OBGYN for a year, and then went to New York Hospital again in OBGYN. He came back to Duke in 58 and is a surgical resident, and then finished his surgical training at the Medical College of Virginia, MCV. Some people call it the Miracle College of Virginia. He then joined the U.S. Navy, served on the USS Hampton. He came back to Albemarle, where he practiced solo in 1964, and then he joined Dr. Joe Freeman to form the Albemarle Surgical Clinic, and later Dr. Bruce Barron joined it. His wife Kathy and son Whitman E. Smith III, and known as Erskine, and son John. He loved hunting, fishing, photography, and ornithology. That means birds. He did the first flexible colonoscopies in Stanley County. My only partner I had next, John Stover Gaskin Jr., born in 1928, also down in Anson County in Wadesboro. Now, his father was a doctor. His mother, Madge Gaskin, was a doctor. His brother Joe was a doctor, and his cousin Reid was a doctor, and his uncle Lewis was a doctor. So a bunch of them there. He graduated from Albemarle High School in 1946. He wanted to drop out and join the military, and his daddy wouldn't sign for him. He went to Chapel Hill and got a bachelor's in chemistry, and then when he graduated, he joined the United States Air Force, became a fighter pilot. He flew an F-84 fighter bomber in the Korean War. He was shot down over the North China Sea and was in the water being strafed by MiGs. Now, that would be a scary situation for me. Finally, they came and fished him out of the water. After he got out of the Air Force, he went to medical school at Duke, and he did. And since there was no family practice residency back then, he did 6-month internships in pediatrics, OB/GYN, internal medicine, and general surgery. He was a solo practitioner from 61 to 67. And in 67, as Dr. Seltzer mentioned, he with Dr. Kelly and Ross and Jolly formed the Elmont Family Medical Clinic. Now, in 1967, AMA was recruiting doctors to go to Vietnam to treat civilians over there, and he volunteered for 2 months. Well, as much as he had a disregard for rules and regulations and a love for flying, he managed to work his way onto a combat flight as a civilian on one of those. He didn't fly it. He was sitting in the, bombardier seat. But quite an adventure anyway. In 1970, he used the first nurse practitioner in Stanley County, Janet Vaughn. She was actually Janet Blake back then. In 1976, he left Family Medical Clinic and started his own clinic. And in 1980, some hotshot named Eric Johnson joined him in practice. When he was chief of staff, along with he and Dr. Edens and Dr. Frank Greene helped establish the first CCU. We took Duke medical students for many years. He was a team physician for Albemarle High School football for 23 years. He loved fast cars and playing Santa Claus. Now, I got to tell you a story about Dr. Edens and Dr. Gaskin, both characters and very strong-willed people. Dr. Gaskin would get in an irregular heart rhythm called atrial fibrillation. Nowadays, that's treated with blood thinners usually for about 6 weeks, and then they try to shock you and get you back into a normal rhythm. Well, Dr. Gaskin he could tell when his heart went out of rhythm. He'd call Dr. Edens. They'd meet in the back of the x-ray department, say at 6 a.m., and with no anesthesia or anything, Dr. Edens would pop him with the paddles. If you're getting a pretty good jolt all at once, convert him to a regular rhythm, and he'd come on to the office. I didn't know he was doing this for years, and one time he was a little late, and I said, well, are you okay? Where have you been? He said, oh, yeah, Buck just had to pop me with the paddles. I said, what? They would be thrown off any hospital staff these days if they were pulled that stuff. But that was Dr. Gaskin and Dr. Honey. Okay. One busy afternoon, I remember we had this kid had a long 6-inch laceration on his left arm, and he's a hotshot kid. He knew everything, and he said, "Doc, could I do my own stitches?" And I said, "Suit yourself." Okay, let's see who else. Joel Honeycutt was the first OB/GYN guy, and no one knows he came and he left. Now one that stayed and stayed. Wilkerson Davis Fort, Dr. Fort. He was born in 1926 in Lumpkin, Georgia. His parents were peanut farmers. He played basketball against Jimmy Carter in high school. Jimmy was going to Plains High School. He went to college at North Georgia College, and then the war started, and he was in the Army. They were training him to be a translator of Japanese when we invaded Japan. Anyway, after that, he got out of the Army, went back in family business, and then he decided, I'm tired of working, I'm going to go become a doctor. So he went, got a bachelor's in chemistry from University of Georgia, and he went to medical school at the University of Tennessee at Memphis. Memphis is that greasy little spot at the end of Tennessee, right by the river over there. And then he did OB/GYN at the Medical College of Virginia, and there he met Dr. Whitman Smith, who was also there. Small world, as Dr. Seltzer points out. He practiced in Lumberton, North Carolina, and then Dr. Whit Smith lured him to Albemarle, and he came in 1965 with solo OBGYN doctor, which was a lot. That meant you were delivering babies all the time. Dr. John Herring joined him, and later Dr. Robert H. Gaither joined him to form the Albemarle Women's Clinic there on 5th Street. He was a county commissioner for 8 years, which means you can make a lot of enemies. But during that time, they built the Stanley County Library, they built the courthouse, and Piedmont Nursing Center, the first real nursing center here in Albemarle. Loyal member of the First Presbyterian Church. Anyone here ever had a president or a presidential candidate spend the night in their house? We haven't. But in 1975, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter spent a night in the Fort's house. Now, while we're talking about baby deliverers, we'll talk about John Harvard Herring. I don't know how, do you know how he got the middle name Harvard? Was it for the beats or for the college? Anyway, born in 1934 in Jackson, Mississippi. His daddy was a preacher. Dr. Herring went to 9 different schools in 9 different states growing up. Finally went to Osceola High School in Arkansas and graduated. Went to one of those Baptist colleges called Baylor. And then he also went to that greasy little spot at the end of Tennessee at UT Memphis. He was in the Navy for 10 years, and then he did his internship at the U.S. Naval Hospital in 58 and 59. By the way, I had this a friend of mine who was explaining that he had worked at a naval hospital, and this lady said, "You mean they have a hospital just to treat navals?" That really did happen. Oh, they don't have those hospitals. Let's see. He came to Stanley County in '68 and joined Dr. Fort, as we said. And they did full round of OBGYN, very, very busy. He also served the North Carolina Air National Guard as a flight surgeon for about another 20 years. He's an Order of the Kentucky Colonel, accomplished pianist and organist, and his wife Bonnie and 3 kids. He, of course, attended First Baptist Church here. There was once a woman, had 3 sons, and on her 80th birthday, the first son was a big shot attorney, and so he gave Mama a brand new Lamborghini, all the bells and whistles. Loved it. The second son was a wealthy banker. He gave her a 5,000 square foot house with a swimming pool and all the fancy things a house could have. Well, the third son was just a struggling country doctor. He couldn't figure out what to get Mama, so he went to a pet store, and the pet store owner said, "I've got this parrot who lived with a monk. He can recite the entire book of St. Matthew, the entire gospel." The guy said, "That is great." So anyway, they all 3 sons gave their mama the presents. And so the mom wrote thank you cards. And to the first, she said, "That car was way too fancy. I couldn't figure it out. And I'm sticking with my old Chevy Impala." The second one she said, "That house is too big. I'm sticking back to my little house." And to the third, she said, "That was the best chicken I ever ate." We might be wearing them out by now, Dr. Seltzer. I'm going to let you roll along. Okay, the 1970s brought us Vietnam, designated hitter, inflation. Inflation? What? Gas lines? OPEC? Never heard of it. Watergate? Okay. I'll make a brief introduction.
Okay, well, a man came to see the doctor, and the doctor says, "What can I do for you?" He says, "I think I'm a bridge." He says, "A bridge?" He says, "What's come over you?" He said, "Well, this morning, 16 cars, 4 trucks, an RV, 6 bicyclists, and 10 pedestrians." I'm going to diverge a little bit here, digress, to talk about 2 very important things. In my opinion, the most remarkable, 2 most remarkable aspects of medical care in my lifetime, and probably in all of America. And the first has nothing to do with putting hands on patients. The second does. So I want to mention this because I think it's worth telling, especially those who aren't aware of it. The first most important development in the history of medicine was that 8-letter word, Medicare. National health insurance was first proposed by Theodore Roosevelt when he campaigned for re-election in 1912. However, there was inadequate party support for this issue, and his bid for a 3rd term was unsuccessful. Fast forward to President Harry Truman in November 1945, just several months after the end of World War II. He advocated Congress to establish a national health insurance fund that he envisioned would pay for doctor visits, hospital care, lab studies, nursing care, and even dental visits. And that was before Joe Namath says, call and find out your zip code. Despite President Truman's lobbying to pass legislation, Congress balked, and this issue lay dormant for almost 20 years. In the midst of his term, President John F. Kennedy pushed for health insurance coverage after a study indicated that 56% of Americans over age 65 had no health insurance coverage. Unfortunately, JFK's assassination plus escalation of the Vietnam War derailed this effort until President Lyndon Johnson, with his Great Society platform, was able to persuade Congress to pass H.R. Bill 6675, which he signed into law on July 30th, 1965, my 16th birthday, at Independence, Missouri, home of former President Truman. Congress allotted $10 billion to fund the first wave of Medicare expenses. Enrollment began in 1966, and during its first 12 months of existence, Medicare had 19 million enrollees for both Medicare A, which is hospital expenses, and Medicare B, outpatient care. The first Medicare enrollees were President and Mrs. Truman. When Medicare first began, hospital physicians submitted bills to Medicare, and Uncle Sam paid what was billed. It didn't take many years for the government bean counters to realize how much greater than the initial $10 billion allotted was being paid out. Some physicians gamed the system and removed numerous tiny harmless skin growths and billed Medicare for huge amounts. Others posted enormous charges for hospital care, office visits, and other services. In response to the end of the 60s, regulations were developed to try to curb charges, starting with hospital care and in particular the days of stay. You couldn't just admit a patient and let them languish there for 3 weeks when these rules went into effect. Outpatient surgery was non-existent, so one of the driving factors to establish outpatient surgery was saving on inpatient costs. Compliance with voluntary cost-limiting rules was the first voluntary, and the result was less effective than mask mandates during the COVID pandemic. In 1972, President Nixon signed into law the first major change to Medicare. The program would be enlarged to offer coverage to citizens under age 65 with long-term disabilities after a wait of 2 years from the date of total disability, as well as those with ESRD, that's end-stage renal disease, also known as kidney failure. Patients on dialysis, either at home or at a dialysis center, would be covered within 3 months after the diagnosis was established. At the end of his first term in 72, President Nixon instituted wage and price controls to try to curb inflation. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Businesses were taxed to obey, and so were other arms of the government. These controls were not permanent for private businesses, but became fixed for Medicare and are still in effect this day. Medicine is the only specialty, or the only discipline in the American workforce that are still subject to wage and price controls, meaning that you cannot raise your prices for Medicare patients more than a specified increment each year, which is usually quite low. The Consumer Price Index is a metric indicative of the amount of increase that you may give, and in medicine, your prices for all services have to parallel Medicare prices. They can be larger, they cannot be out of proportion. Those are still in effect. People may be confused by Medicaid and Medigap. Medicaid is a medical assistance program mandated by the federal government, administered by individual states, each with its own qualifications. In general terms, patients of all ages are eligible for Medicaid if their medical expenses outstrip their ability to pay for these. There are set bar, which is a certain percent of the federal poverty level, and if your income is below that, you're eligible for Medicaid. Medicare A is free of charge to eligible citizens. Discussion of Medicare B, which is standard supplements, and Medicare C, the so-called Advantage plans, with different stipulations, are beyond the scope of this presentation. Medicare D prescription drug coverage did not become law until 2003, will be covered in the next part. In 1980, federal laws were expanded and Medigap, or Medicare supplement plans, were created. In 1982, hospice services were included in Medicare benefits. How Medicare will be funded moving forward is controversial. We can talk about the next time. Right now, Medicare is handled by Social Security, and that is funded by payroll taxes contributed by employees and employers. As you know, those continue to rise. Percentage is deducted, and Medicaid, a special Medicare tax was enacted in the early 1990s. I think it's safe to say there's been talks from some politicians about privatizing Medicare. That's not going to happen. No politician in the United States of America is going to tamper with Social Security or Medicare and leave 130 million people out in the cold. Now, the second development is medical, and in my opinion, it is the greatest breakthrough in medicine, and that is the cardiac catheterization that led to coronary bypass surgery and repair of damaged coronary arteries. No single procedure has increased the quality of life and lengthened life more than anything else that I know of. And it was discovered by accident with someone with a link to Stanley County. Dr. Mason Sones, who was from Mississippi and went to the University of Maryland Medical School, has no direct bearing as a Stanley County physician. He went to the service at the end of World War II, and then did his internship and residency at that hospital in Cleveland, and seems to get quite a bit of publicity and knows something about hearts, the Cleveland Clinic, and he became a specialist in angiography. That's a general term for injecting dye into arteries. Coronary catheterization, putting the catheter into the coronary arteries, was thought to be too risky and likely to lead to fatal arrhythmia, so that had not been done, but they were X-ray and other vessels. In 1958, Dr. Sones was attempting to inject dye into a man's aorta to look for the problem there, and the catheter slipped and went into one of the arteries, which leave the aorta and go to the surface of the heart. Well, the team immediately went on alert, were ready to open his chest and do open heart massage. CPR did not exist then, and because it was thought the patient's heart would stop beating. Instead, the patient went into atrial fibrillation. They were able to get him out of that very easily. The man had no further trouble, and from then on, cardiac catheterization took off. That was 1958. It was modified. The amount of dye needed was less. The techniques by physicians was better. The instruments were better, and pretty soon in the middle 1960s, catheterizations were quite common, and a lot of information was useful. Christian Barnard's open heart surgery actually performed in South Africa was not long after the first coronary artery bypass graft operation, which was performed at the Cleveland Clinic by a colleague of Dr. Sones, Dr. Renee Favalaro. That was a successful operation where veins taken from the legs were used to replace arteries that were blocked in the heart. That catheterization and the subsequent surgeon developments that led to angioplasty, stents, and even more elegant procedures now, I think is responsible for improving the quality of life and the length of life for more people than any other procedure, all stemming from an accidental misstep in the lab in 1958. Why did I bring all this up? Dr. Mason Sones' first cousin was the late Jean Bryan Hartzell, wife of Clyde Hartzell, the local locksmith. She and Mason Sones were first cousins. I knew this family for over 30 years, and she was a devoted member of the First Presbyterian Church. I consider this a small world incident. Okay. Well, it's about time for Cinderella's slipper to break, but we're getting there. 1970s, is my turn to continue that?
I was supposed to do medical breakthroughs when you go to that. 1971, the first study proving the treatment of hypertension could decrease the incidence of strokes. The thiazide diuretics were invented, and they were really the first effective blood pressure medicine that didn't cause significant side effects. I can remember more than one patient saying, "Doc, that medicine got any side effects?" And I said, "What if I told you that it caused heart disease, stroke, cancer, emphysema? Would you be willing to take it?" "Well, no, Doc, I don't want that." So I would reach into their pocket and pull out their pack of cigarettes and said, "But you're willing to fire up 20 of these every day," which are known to cause that. Anyway, oh well, human nature. In 1971, the first CAT scan was developed. Wasn't used clinically until 75. The 72, first PAs and nurse practitioners came out. 73, insulin pump was developed. 74, total hip replacement. They only did a right hip at first. And in 1978, this is a significant accomplishment, the last fatal case of smallpox was reported. Okay, I'll let you talk.
The patient came to see a doctor, and the doctor says, "What can I do for you today?" And the patient says, "Somebody painted my house with graffiti last night." The doctor says, "Well, so what?" He said, "I couldn't read a darn thing, and I thought you wrote it." So, and in the interest of time, I'm going to omit the Stanley County public interest things. Those are nice, but we need to move on and get our appointed job done. Dr. Lewis A. Coffin III was born in New York City, and he graduated from a prep school in Washington, Connecticut, then went to the University of Virginia in college and graduated from Duke University Medical School. He did his internship in pediatrics at St. Louis Children's Hospital, then became the chief resident of pediatrics at Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem. After that, he did an additional year of training at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children in Philadelphia. He then spent 2 years in the Navy, and he was, during that time, was chief of pediatrics at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Charleston. Dr. Coffin had some wanderlust. He started practice in Spruce Pine, North Carolina after his residency. Then he moved to San Mateo, California, then to Santa Barbara, California, where he was for 7 years. Then in the early 1970s, he joined Dr. Claude Ballinger with Stanley Pediatrics. Dr. Coffin was a diplomate of the American Board of Pediatrics, a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and also was interested in allergies. His lifelong behavior of going from one place to the other continued. He was just here a few years and then left, and that's all we have on him, Dr. Lewis Coffin. Dr. James W. Reynolds Jr. was the first residency-trained ear, nose, and throat physician in Stanley County. He was born in 1938 in Newton, North Carolina, and attended the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, receiving a bachelor's degree in '64 and an MD degree in '68. Thereafter, he went to the military service. He served internship at Indiana University Medical Center in Indianapolis and a residency in otolaryngology at the University of Texas, Galveston for 3 years. He was also trained in plastic surgery. After his training, he served the United States Air Force for 2 years, achieving the rank of major. Then in '71, he opened a solo practice in former Yadkin Medical Office Complex at 121 Yadkin Street in Albemarle. He attended a Lutheran church. We did not learn if it was the Lutheran church, First Lutheran, less than 2 blocks from here. Dr. Reynolds produced 1 daughter and 4 sons. His tenure in Albemarle was brief, and he relocated to Salisbury several years after settling in Stanley County. He practiced in Rowan County until 1991 and passed on in 2020 at the age of 81. Dr. Robert Kutcher. Robert Irving Kutcher was born in Trafford, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. His family relocated to Capic, Michigan, not far north of Detroit, to live in the Kutcher family farm when he was 12. Dr. Kutcher attended Albion College, where he attained a bachelor's degree in 1954. Thereafter, he enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School and graduated number 1 in his class in 1958. He served a 1-year internship at the University of Nebraska in medical school in Omaha. Then he spent a 3-year hitch in the Navy, where he was deployed to Japan and then later to San Diego. After discharge from active duty, Dr. Kutcher returned to Michigan in 1962, completed a residency in internal medicine, and then after finishing his training, he moved back to Southern California and began private practice near San Diego, where he stayed for 8 years. During this time, he stayed in the U.S. Naval Reserve. In 1971, Dr. Kutcher relocated to Norwood, where he joined his Navy buddy, Dr. Dick Lyles, in primary care. This union lasted 4 years, at which time he relocated the final time, returning to his home area in eastern Michigan to a small town called Deckerville, not far from the family farm near Capic. In Deckerville, he had many positions in community hospital and delivered babies, assisted in surgery, and retired in 2005 at age 72. He was a loyal fan of the University of Michigan athletic teams, was a regular attendee at football games at the very tiny stadium in which the Wolverines played. He often wore blue and maize clothing. Interestingly, he was a patron of the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, which is just a small drive from Michigan. Dr. Kutcher died in Deckerville, Michigan in 2019 at age 86. Dr. Larry Jenkins. Dr. Larry P. Jenkins was born in 1940 in Knoxville, Tennessee. He attended high school there and went to Maryville College, graduating in 3 years in 1961. He went to medical school at the University of Tennessee Medical School branch in Memphis. Dr. Johnson described what Memphis means to him. And he did his internship at the University of Tennessee Memorial Research Hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, the other end of the state. That was in 1964 and 1965. He was in the military service from 66 to 69. He served in the Army, reached the rank of major, and was stationed in Hawaii as a flight surgeon. He then returned to the lower 48 and did residency in Philadelphia in ophthalmology, which was from 1969 to 1972, and entered solo practice in ophthalmology in Stanley County in December of 1972. Dr. Jenkins was interested in spectator sports, and like many, he held offices and positions in the County Medical Society and on the hospital staff. He and his first wife, Doris, had 5 children. She expired, and he remarried. And then at the end of his practice, he reached out and also worked at urgent care in Asheboro and perhaps some other areas that we're unaware of. He lived on Knollwood Drive off of US 52 North in Albemarle, and Dr. Jenkins expired last year at the age of 81 of complications of COVID. In the middle 70s, Dr. Ralph Beasley was the first full-time psychiatrist to practice in Stanley County. We do not have a lot of information available about him. In the middle 70s, he opened up his practice sometime at the 123 North 1st Street in Albemarle, the former office of Dr. Richard Ross, before the latter joined Albemarle Family Medical Center. Dr. Beasley lived on Northridge Drive in Albemarle in the Melker Heights neighborhood and had twin daughters. That's all I could discover about his family life. Besides his office practice, Dr. Beasley also saw patients at Stanley County Mental Health Office. I could not determine the site of this facility after initially it was located at the former nurses' residence on the hospital campus. Additionally, he attended to some patients as inpatients in the north wing of the first floor of the old Stanley County Hospital. He also administered electroconvulsive therapy, also known as ECT, EST, and shock treatments to selected patients in a section of the first floor dedicated to this. In 1977, Dr. Beasley relocated to Moore County, and that's all the information we have on him. What do you think?
We've gone on longer than Gone with the Wind.
Okay, I'll tell you what, that's a real good idea. We've been talking over 2 hours. We can start again at 75 and make the next one.
I'll just tell you the
I'll tell you
doctors I didn't get to.
Well, why don't we finish the 70s and leave it at that, okay?
I'll just do a brief. Dr. Gaither is here, and this comes from Dr. Gaither, so I may have taken inadequate notes. He can correct me later. Born on St. Patrick's Day in 1938 in Washington, D.C., hometown Hyattsville, Maryland. His father, Frank, works for Bosch & Lomb, where they made lenses. He went to Johns Hopkins University in Maryland for his bachelor's degree, medical school, George Washington School of Medicine in D.C. He then was you were William Bowman Hospital in El Paso in the Army, and also at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He also, one of the few people I know who's ever been to Greenland. He served in the Army up there. He said he was told that there's a girl behind every tree. There are no trees in Greenland. Did his residency, Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver, in U.S. Army at Augusta, Georgia, where he got free tickets to the Masters golf tournament every year. Then practiced in Albemarle from 72 to, I believe, 99 with Dr. Herring and Dr. Fort. And he and Donna Jean have an incredible collection of antiques, and he is an expert calligrapher. First Presbyterian Church. Dr. Bruce Barron, native of Maine, and practiced here in the 1970s. Dr. Stephen Charles Seltzer, I'll try to be brief, born 1949 in Hillsborough, Illinois, relative of Ray Shaw in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He's probably the only person I know who's got a relative in the Baseball Hall of Fame, played for the White Sox.
Lowest position player batting average of anybody in the Hall of Fame, but an excellent defensive catcher.
He was an outstanding student at Hillsborough High School and was a medalist on the golf team. He went to college. You'll notice a pattern of a fugitive here. He went to the University of Illinois, and then he showed up in Chapel Hill, and finally at McMurray College in graduating in 1970. Then he went to University of Iowa for medical school, graduating in 76, and the fugitive pattern reemerges. He was down in Savannah, and then on Greensboro and Moses Cone, and out in Iowa. Came here in 78 and joined Albemarle Family Medical Center. At the close of his career, last 5 years, I want to give this man credit. He covered all 4 nursing homes. Just a grueling job. I don't know how he did it all. Some interesting quirks. He has repertory for an infinite quantity of worthless information. especially rock and roll trivia. He also is a baseball fan. He's a devout Cardinals fan, and you could tell when you went in the hospital during baseball season if the Cardinals had won the night before, because if he was like this, they got beat. If he's like this, you could read it all over. Anyway, he also has limitless recall of corny jokes, probably due to the fact that Hillsborough, Illinois grows 175 bushels of corn per acre, him included. Okay. Anyway, he also was a DJ in college, and his wife, Marlene, and sons. And the only other person, Dr. Cabot-Wasson in Norwood, but I'm keeping it short.
Okay. I'm only going to mention one more doctor, and that's Dr. Eric Merriman Johnson right here. He actually came in 1980 to Albemarle in July. He was born sometime in the...
It's a handsome rascal, isn't it?
That's a Photoshop. Born sometime before the Common Era, I think 1946, and was born near Ann Arbor, Michigan, in Washtenaw County, and I think he lived in a small town of Chelsea, but was born in Ann Arbor. I hope the medical school obstetricians got the delivery right. Then after that, his father, who was a school superintendent, moved to the Ypsilanti area and was in charge of the Willow Run School District, where Eric started his high school, but then his father got transferred, took a job in Benton Harbor, Michigan, on the other side of the state on Lake Michigan, where Eric graduated. He was a member of the state basketball championship team in 1964. And then he went to college at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo and played on the football team. He was not an All-American.
I had a uniform, let me put it that way.
Okay. He graduated from Western Michigan in 1968, and it didn't take long before Uncle Sam called him, and he was conscripted into the military service and actually served in artillery support in Vietnam and caught fire. I will tell you, many doctors were in the military service, but very few served as an enlisted man in the midst of a firestorm. And Dr. Johnson will not brag about his exploits, but I am so grateful that he served our country the way he did. Then, after his discharge, he bilked the government for more education in the GI Bill. After he was released, he got an early out. He didn't serve 2 years, but that's okay. He was out of the Army by late 1970. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And then he was intending to go to medical school, but decided to beef up his resume by going to graduate school and obtaining a master's degree in biochemistry from Wayne State University in Detroit. And thereafter, he enrolled in medical school there and graduated from 1977. And during the process, he met and married the former Judy Hershka, an RN, and they've been together ever since. He did his residency at the University of Kentucky, internship residency from 1977 to 1980. I don't know how much of Kentucky basketball or bourbon or horse racing he brought with him, but they elected to settle in Albemarle in 1980, not long after their first son was born. They had 3 sons and a daughter, and Eric has told you about his career in practice. There are characters and there are characters, and this is a character. I've met in my travels perhaps 5 people with a razor-sharp wit that can come up with a pun on a moment's notice, and he's one of them. And his patients loved his sense of humor, but he also knew when that was not appropriate to use, and I respect him for that. In Albemarle, he has been the pillar, and he and Judy have been the pillars of the Central United Methodist Church. I believe that's where we're standing now. And he's also been an ardent member of the Albemarle Rotary Club for a number of years. Everybody, or most people, know that they're planning to leave Albemarle. I hope it's not because of me, but they're planning to, they're selling their house, and they plan to move to Knoxville, Tennessee, to be close to their younger son and his family in 2 months. I've tried to awaken him from this bad dream and tell him that he really doesn't want to leave, but I want to see we all want them to do what's best for them, and there's going to be a hole in Albemarle when the Johnsons leave.
Well, we had late night, and,
Can I give the conclusion?
well, pardon?
You got anything else you want to say?
Well, we'll pass up on the final joke.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't get to Dr. Leffler and Dr. Mehta.
Come back next year, we'll get them.
So
We got a bunch of others to do too. We have some others, we'll get to
I
them.
was just going to say one thing. Dr. Mehta was from India, as you probably know, and I heard he's going back to India. And I wrote him a letter. I said, "Dear Dr. Mehta, I understand that you're going back to India. While you're there, could you pick me up 2 mongoose?" That didn't look right. I crossed it. I said, repeated it. I said, "Could you pick me up 2 mongooses?" And that didn't look right either. So I said, "I understand you're going to India. Could you pick me up a mongoose? If you got time, could you pick me up another one?"
Okay. We're gonna close with just one final thing. You know, doctors argue. Doctors
They
basically,
do not.
doctors are basically prima donnas. They're alpha personalities. They're used to running the show. When they get together in a meeting or important, most of the time there's a disagreement. And it's very rare to see doctors in agreement about anything. That just goes with the territory. At the end of 1985, which was our original stopping point, the largest employer in this county, Wisconsin Mills, and its cousin Cannon Mills in Kannapolis, elected to form an HMO. That's a health maintenance organization where enrollment is restricted and doctors and hospitals are excluded in favor of ones that have agreed to the bargains and to bargain with them and accept their fees. And that basically shut the door on all the Albemarle doctors in Stanley Hospital in December of 1985, which would make a serious impact on the income for the physicians and the hospital, and also would be a severe inconvenience to the patients because no doctors or facilities and most of the independent pharmacies in Stanley County were not being asked to participate. So, a full-page ad was taken out in the Stanley News and Press on December 6, 1985. Every single physician on the staff of Stanley County Hospital, plus the hospital itself, plus a number of independent pharmacies.
Talk in the microphone.
Okay, well, I'll have to show. Thank you. Signed this letter protesting this administrative decision, emphasizing that local physicians were not asked to participate in the HMO. Cabarrus Memorial Hospital and physicians in Cabarrus County own the HMO. As it turned out, this project went belly up. It wasn't managed well in Concord, and within just a few months it was abandoned and things went back the way they were. This, in my opinion, is the only time that doctors in Stanley County ever unanimously agreed on anything. Thank you for being with us for 2 hours and 15 minutes. We'll try to make the next version shorter. I don't know if Dr. Johnson will be back for the next version. I'll have to find another stooge. But one way or the other, we're going to do it, and hopefully it won't be as long. But we've enjoyed it very much. We've enjoyed everybody that came out here, and we hope to do it again in the future.
Yeah, and like Dr. Selzer said, just a few hours, they're serving lunch down the hall. So, anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we really